The 87-year-old man sitting quietly in the corner diner had stormed Normandy Beach at age 19. He'd watched his best friend die in his arms, earned 2 Purple Hearts, and carried shrapnel in his leg for 68 years. When a spoiled teenager spit on him and mocked his war stories as boring old man garbage, the restaurant went silent with shock. Then the door opened. 10 bikers walked in, saw what was happening, and what they did next didn't involve a single punch, but it broke that arrogant kid completely and taught him a lesson he'd remember for the rest of his life. The Riverside Diner had been serving the community of Millbrook, Pennsylvania for 53 years, occupying a corner lot on Main Street where 3 generations of the Morrison family had poured coffee, flipped burgers, and created a space where everyone from factory workers to business owners felt welcome. The red vinyl booths were worn smooth by decades of use. The chrome on the counter had been polished by countless elbows, and the smell of coffee and bacon was so deeply embedded in the walls that it greeted you before you even opened the door. Harold Mitchell was a fixture at the Riverside Diner, as much a part of the place as the vintage Coca-Cola sign or the jukebox that still played songs from the 1950s. Every morning at 7 o'clock, without fail, Harold would shuffle through the door, make his way to the corner booth by the window, and order the same breakfast he'd been ordering for 30 years. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, bacon crispy, coffee black, and a small orange juice. At 87 years old, Harold moved slowly, his body bearing the accumulated damage of a long and difficult life. He walked with a pronounced limp, courtesy of the German shrapnel that had torn through his left leg on June 7, 1944, the day after D-Day, when his unit was fighting to secure the beachhead at Normandy. His hands shook slightly from Parkinson's disease, making it difficult to hold his coffee cup without using both hands. His hearing was mostly gone in his right ear from the constant artillery fire he'd endured during the war, and his face bore the deep lines and weathered appearance of someone who had seen things most people couldn't imagine and carried those memories for nearly 7 decades. But Harold's eyes were still sharp and kind, and his mind was clear. He read the newspaper every morning, kept up with current events, and could tell you stories about World War II with a clarity that made you feel like you were right there with him on those blood-soaked beaches or in those frozen foxholes during the Battle of the Bulge. Harold had been just 19 years old when he enlisted in the army in 1943, lying about a heart murmur that should have disqualified him because all his friends were signing up, and he couldn't bear the thought of staying home while they went to fight. He'd been assigned to the 29th Infantry Division and had participated in the D-Day invasion, one of the fortunate ones who made it off Omaha Beach alive when so many of his fellow soldiers did not. He'd fought through France, survived the brutal winter of the Battle of the Bulge, and was part of the forces that eventually pushed into Germany itself. He'd earned 2 Purple Hearts, one for the shrapnel wound in his leg, another for burns he sustained when his transport truck hit a landmine, a Bronze Star for valor when he pulled 3 wounded men to safety under enemy fire, and a French Legion of Honor medal that the French government had awarded to surviving D-Day veterans in a ceremony 10 years ago that Harold had been too humble to mention to anyone until his daughter told the local newspaper. After the war, Harold had come home to Millbrook, married his high school sweetheart Dorothy, worked for 40 years at the local steel mill, raised 3 children, and lived a quiet, dignified life. Dorothy had passed away 8 years ago, and since then, Harold's daily routine had become even more important to him, a structure that gave meaning to days that otherwise felt empty without the woman he'd loved for 60 years. The staff at Riverside Diner adored Harold. He was unfailingly polite, tipped well, despite living on a fixed income, remembered everyone's names, and asked about their families. Jenny, the longtime waitress who usually served him, knew that on the anniversary of Dorothy's death, Harold would sit at his booth, staring out the window for hours, barely touching his food, lost in memories. On those days, she would quietly refill his coffee and leave him to his grief. The younger waitresses loved hearing Harold's stories when the diner was slow. He would tell them about meeting Dorothy at a high school dance, about their first date at a movie theater that no longer existed, about the letters they wrote to each other every day during the war, letters he still kept in a box in his bedroom. He would tell them about his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, pulling out photos with shaking hands and beaming with pride. Sometimes, very rarely, if someone asked and if Harold was in the right mood, he would talk about the war. Not the heroic parts. Harold never talked about the medals or the brave things he'd done. He talked about the fear, the cold, the friends he'd lost, the young men who died far from home in a country they'd never seen before. He talked about the weight of those memories, the faces he still saw in his dreams, the sounds that still made him flinch. Fireworks on the 4th of July, cars backfiring, doors slamming. "People thank me for my service," Harold had told Jenny once, "and I appreciate it, I really do. But I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because it needed doing, and because the boys next to me were doing it too. The real heroes are the ones who didn't come home. I just survived. That's not heroism. That's luck." This particular Saturday morning in late October started like any other. Harold arrived at 7, took his usual booth, ordered his usual breakfast from Jenny, and settled in with his newspaper and coffee. The diner was moderately busy with the weekend breakfast crowd, families, couples, a few regulars at the counter, and a table of what appeared to be high school students celebrating someone's birthday. What Harold didn't notice, because his hearing was poor and because he was focused on his newspaper, was that one of those high school students was Trenton Blake, the 17-year-old son of real estate mogul Richard Blake, and that Trenton was drunk at 8 in the morning and in a particularly nasty mood. Trenton Blake was everything Harold Mitchell was not. Where Harold was humble, Trenton was arrogant. Where Harold had earned respect through sacrifice and service, Trenton demanded respect because of his father's money. Where Harold treated everyone with courtesy, Trenton treated people as obstacles or servants depending on whether they could do something for him. Trenton attended Millbrook Academy, the expensive private school that served the children of the town's wealthy families, and he made sure everyone knew it. He drove a Mercedes G-Wagon that cost more than most people in Millbrook earned in 2 years, a gift for his 16th birthday. He wore designer clothes, expensive watches, and an expression of perpetual contempt for anyone he deemed beneath him, which was almost everyone. His father, Richard, had made a fortune buying up properties in Millbrook and the surrounding areas, often using aggressive tactics that displaced longtime residents and small businesses. The Blake name was associated with money and power, but not with respect or affection. Richard Blake was feared, not liked, and his son was following precisely in his footsteps. Trenton had been out all night at a party, had been drinking since midnight, and had convinced his equally intoxicated friends to stop at the Riverside Diner for breakfast before heading home. They were loud, obnoxious, and making the other diners uncomfortable, but the staff was trying to serve them quickly and get them out without incident. That plan fell apart when Trenton noticed Harold sitting alone in his corner booth. "Hey," Trenton said loudly, nudging one of his friends. "Look at that old dude. He's like 100 years old. What's he even doing here? Shouldn't he be in a nursing home or dead or something?" His friends laughed, the uncomfortable laughter of people who knew this was wrong but lacked the courage to say so. Harold heard the comment but chose to ignore it, focusing on his newspaper. He dealt with cruel young people before and had learned that engaging with them usually made things worse. But Trenton, emboldened by alcohol and the laughter of his friends, wasn't done. He stood up and walked over to Harold's booth, his steps unsteady, his voice carrying throughout the suddenly quiet diner. "Hey, old man, I'm talking to you." Harold looked up slowly, his expression neutral. "Can I help you, son?" "Son?" Trenton laughed mockingly. "Don't call me son, Grandpa. I'm not your son. I'm not related to you, thank God. My family has standards." Jenny hurried over, her face flushed with anger and concern. "Trenton, leave Mr. Mitchell alone. Go back to your table." "Or what?" Trenton sneered. "You'll call my dad? Please. My dad owns half this town. He could buy this crappy diner and turn it into a parking lot if he wanted to." Harold spoke quietly, his voice measured and calm despite the provocation. "Young man, I'm just trying to have my breakfast in peace. I don't want any trouble." "Trouble?" Trenton leaned against the booth, invading Harold's space. "You look like trouble to me. You look like you're taking up space that younger, more important people could be using. What are you even doing here? What do old people like you contribute to society? You're just waiting around to die, collecting your government checks, being useless." The diner had gone completely silent now. Everyone was watching, horrified by Trenton's behavior, but uncertain what to do. Jenny had her phone out, clearly calling someone, probably the police or Trenton's father. Harold's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "I'm a veteran. I served in World War II. I fought so that young people like you would have the freedom to—" "Oh God," Trenton interrupted, rolling his eyes dramatically. "Here we go with the war stories. Do you old guys ever talk about anything else? That was like 1,000 years ago. Nobody cares. World War II is boring. You're boring. All you old veterans do is sit around telling the same stories over and over about how great you were." Harold's hands were shaking now, and not just from the Parkinson's. He was a gentleman, not prone to anger, but something about this boy's casual dismissal of the worst years of his life, of the friends who had died, of the sacrifices made, it cut deep. "Young man," Harold said, his voice still controlled, but with an edge now, "those boring stories are about real people who died real deaths so that you could sit here and insult me. I watched my best friend bleed to death on Omaha Beach. I held him while he called for his mother. He was 19 years old, younger than you, so maybe show a little respect." Trenton's response was to laugh, a cruel, mocking laugh that made several people in the diner gasp in disbelief. "Respect? For what? For being old? For fighting in some war that happened before my grandparents were even born? Get over yourself, old man. You're not special. You're just old and pathetic and—" What happened next would be talked about in Millbrook for years to come. Trenton Blake, drunk and angry and desperate to prove his dominance in front of his friends, leaned close to Harold Mitchell's face and spit on him. Deliberately, cruelly. The saliva hit Harold's cheek, and he sat frozen in shock. This elderly veteran, who had survived beaches and battles and decades of life, humiliated by a spoiled teenager in his favorite diner. The restaurant erupted. Jenny screamed. Several diners stood up, outraged. Someone shouted, "What the hell is wrong with you?" But Trenton just laughed, high-fiving his friends, filming Harold's shocked, hurt expression on his phone. "That's what I think of your war stories, Grandpa," Trenton said. "Boring old man garbage." He turned to walk back to his table, still laughing, still filming, completely confident that nothing would happen to him, because nothing ever did. His father's money and influence had protected him from consequences his entire life. Why would this time be any different? Then the door to the Riverside Diner opened. 10 men walked in, and the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. They wore leather vests over denim jackets, boots that had seen thousands of miles of road, and badges that identified them as members of the Iron Veterans Motorcycle Club. Most of them were in their 60s and 70s. Several were older. One man looked to be in his early 80s. All of them were veterans. All of them had been riding together for decades, and all of them had stopped for breakfast after their monthly memorial ride to honor fallen brothers. The Iron Veterans MC was not a one-percenter club. They were legitimate veterans who rode motorcycles as a way to process trauma, build brotherhood, and honor their service. They did charity rides for wounded warriors, visited VA hospitals, attended military funerals when the family had no one else, and served as an unofficial support network for veterans struggling with physical and mental health issues. The president of the club was a man named Jack Gunner Patterson, 73 years old, Vietnam veteran, former Marine Corps gunnery sergeant, and the kind of man who commanded respect the moment he entered a room. He was medium height but powerfully built despite his age, with silver hair cut in a military fade, a weathered face that had seen combat in the jungles of Southeast Asia, and eyes that missed nothing. Behind him were 9 other veterans, men who had served in Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan, and in one case, Korea. They represented different branches of service, different wars, different backgrounds, but they were united by their military service and their commitment to looking after fellow veterans. They walked in laughing about something, ready to order breakfast and swap stories. But the moment they saw Harold Mitchell sitting in his booth with spit on his face and tears in his eyes, everything stopped. Gunner's eyes swept the scene, the elderly veteran clearly humiliated, the drunk teenager with his phone out, still filming and laughing, the horrified staff and customers, the palpable tension in the air. In about 3 seconds, he assessed the entire situation with the kind of rapid evaluation that combat veterans never lose. He held up one hand, and his brothers stopped, behind him, silent and alert. Then Gunner walked slowly toward Trenton's table, his boots heavy on the diner floor, each step deliberate and purposeful. Trenton noticed him approaching and tried to maintain his bravado. "Can I help you, old man? You lost? Biker bar is down the street." Gunner stopped at the table and looked down at Trenton with an expression that made the teenager's friends suddenly find their plates very interesting. When Gunner spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried throughout the silent diner. "Did you just spit on that veteran?" Trenton's confidence wavered slightly. "What veteran? You mean the old guy?" "So what if I did? He was boring me with his stupid war stories. I did everyone a favor shutting him up." Behind Gunner, The other 9 veterans had spread out, forming a loose semicircle. None of them were threatening overtly, but their presence was overwhelming. 10 serious, solid men who had seen real combat and who were clearly not impressed with this drunk teenager. One of them, a man with a Vietnam veteran patch on his vest, spoke up. "That old guy is wearing a 29th Infantry Division pin on his jacket. Do you know what that means?" Trenton shrugged. "Some military thing? Who cares?" "The 29th Infantry Division stormed Omaha Beach on D-Day," the veteran continued, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Omaha Beach had the highest casualty rate of any D-Day landing. Men drowned with 80-pound packs, were shot before they left the boats, died by the hundreds in the first minutes. Surviving that required more courage than you'll ever have in your entire privileged, worthless life." Another veteran, younger than the others, probably in his 50s, added, "I served in Iraq, lost friends there, came home with PTSD that nearly destroyed my life. But even on my worst day, even at my lowest point, I would never disrespect a World War II veteran. Those men saved the world, literally saved it. And you spit on one?" Trenton was starting to look less confident, glancing towards the door, probably calculating whether he could make it past these men. "Look, it was just a joke. The old guy was being annoying." "His name is Harold Mitchell," Jenny interrupted, her voice shaking with emotion. "He comes here every day. He's the kindest, most respectful customer we have. He served his country when he was younger than you, saw things you can't imagine, and came home and lived a good, decent life. And you spit on him because you were annoyed. You should be ashamed." Gunnar held up his hand for silence, and everyone immediately quieted. He looked at Trenton with an expression that made the teenager shrink back in his seat. "Here's what's going to happen," Gunnar said calmly. "You're going to stand up, walk over to Mr. Mitchell and apologize, a real apology. Not because we're making you, but because it's the right thing to do, and because you need to understand the magnitude of what you just did." "And if I don't?" Trenton tried to sound tough, but his voice cracked. "If you don't," Gunnar continued, "then we're going to make sure everyone you know sees the video we're about to take of this moment. Every student at your school, every college you apply to, your father's business associates, everyone. We're going to make sure that when people Google your name, this is the first thing that comes up. Trenton Blake, the spoiled kid who spit on a World War II veteran. That reputation will follow you forever." Another veteran, one with a graying beard and kind eyes, added, "Or you can choose to do the right thing. Apologize genuinely. Try to understand why what you did was so wrong. Maybe learn something and become a better person. Your choice, kid, but you've got about 30 seconds to decide." Trenton looked around, at the 10 veterans blocking any easy exit, at the other customers all watching with expressions of disgust, at his friends who were clearly not going to back him up, at Jenny who had her phone out recording. He was trapped, and for the first time in his privileged life, he couldn't call his father to make the problem disappear. He stood up on shaky legs and walked toward Harold's booth. The elderly veteran was wiping his face with a napkin, his hands trembling, his eyes downcast. He looked small and hurt, and far older than his 87 years. Trenton stood there for a long moment, and something in Harold's defeated posture seemed to crack through the teenager's alcohol-fueled bravado. Maybe it was the reality of what he'd done, or maybe it was the 10 military veterans watching him with expressions of absolute disgust. But whatever the reason, when Trenton spoke, his voice was smaller, less confident. "Sir, Mr. Mitchell, I'm sorry. I was drunk and stupid, and I said terrible things, and I'm sorry for what I did." Harold looked up slowly, and there were tears in his eyes that made several people in the diner start crying too. "Do you understand why what you did was wrong?" Trenton swallowed hard. You served your country. You fought in a war. And I disrespected that. I disrespected you." "It's not about respecting me," Harold said quietly, his voice shaking. "It's about respecting the sacrifice. I'm nobody special. But the men who died, my friends, who never got to come home, never got to have families or careers or lives, they deserve respect. And when you mock my service, you mock their deaths. That's what you don't understand. This isn't about me. It's about honoring everyone who served, and especially those who didn't make it back." The diner was silent, except for the sound of people crying. One of the veterans had his hand over his mouth, clearly emotional. Gunnar was standing with his arms crossed, watching Trenton carefully to see if the lesson was sinking in. "I'm sorry," Trenton said again, and this time it sounded more genuine. "I'm really sorry. I didn't understand. I was being cruel and stupid and—" He broke off, overwhelmed, and to everyone's surprise, the 17-year-old started crying. Not performative tears designed to get out of trouble, but genuine sobs of shame and regret, as the magnitude of what he'd done crashed down on him. Harold did something then that shocked everyone in the diner. He reached out with a shaking hand and gently touched Trenton's arm. "Son, you made a terrible mistake today, but you're young and young people make mistakes. The question is whether you learn from them. Do you understand now why what you did was so wrong?" Trenton nodded, unable to speak through his tears. "Then let this be the lesson," Harold said softly. "Treat people with respect, all people, regardless of age or status or anything else. We're all just trying to get through this life as best we can. Kindness costs nothing, but cruelty can destroy everything. Can you remember that?" "Yes, sir," Trenton managed. "I'm so sorry." Gunnar stepped forward. "The apology is a start, but apologies without action are meaningless. Here's what happens now. Jenny has called the police. They're on their way. You're going to stay here and face whatever legal consequences come from assaulting an elderly veteran. Your father doesn't get to make this disappear. You face it, you deal with it, and you learn from it." "But also," another veteran added, "we're going to give you an opportunity. Our club visits the VA hospital every month. We spend time with veterans who are sick, dying, or alone. You're going to come with us for the next 6 months. You're going to listen to their stories, learn their names, understand their sacrifices. You're going to see what service actually means. That's your punishment and your education." Trenton nodded, still crying, clearly overwhelmed, but also seeming to understand that he was being offered something. Not just punishment, but a chance to actually change. The police arrived shortly after. 2 officers who knew Harold well, and who were clearly not pleased to hear what had happened. They took statements from witnesses, reviewed Jenny's video of the incident, and made it clear that despite Trenton's age and his father's influence, assault charges would be filed. "But officer," Trenton said, his voice small, "I want to accept responsibility. I did this. It was wrong. I want to face consequences. Please, don't let my dad make this go away. I need to face this." The officers looked surprised. Apparently Trenton Blake asking for consequences instead of calling his father for help was unprecedented. They looked at Gunnar, who nodded slightly, and then back at Trenton. "All right, son," the senior officer said. "We'll process this properly. You'll have to go to court and the judge will decide what happens. But the fact that you're taking responsibility, that's going to matter." After the police left with Trenton, who went quietly and with his head down, the veterans surrounded Harold's booth. Gunnar sat down across from him, and the elderly World War II vet looked up at these younger veterans, men who had their own wars, their own scars, their own demons, and something passed between them that transcended words. "Thank you," Harold said simply. "We're brothers," Gunnar replied. "All of us, regardless of which war we fought. We look after each other, always." One of the Vietnam veterans slid into the booth next to Harold. "Mr. Mitchell, I know today was hard, but I want you to know that what you did, surviving D-Day, fighting through France, serving your country, it matters. It will always matter. And any punk kid who doesn't understand that needs to be educated." Harold nodded, wiping his eyes. "I don't usually talk about the war. People say thank you for your service, and I appreciate it. But they don't really want to hear the details. They don't want to know what it was really like." "We do," another veteran said. "If you ever want to talk, really talk, about what you experienced, we're here. We understand. We've got our own demons from our own wars. And sometimes talking to someone who gets it, that helps." Jenny brought over coffee for all the veterans, on the house, and for the next 2 hours, Harold Mitchell sat surrounded by 10 men who had served in different wars, but who shared a bond that civilians could never fully understand. He told them stories about D-Day, about the friends he'd lost, about the fear and the cold, and the things he still saw in his dreams 68 years later. And they listened, really listened, and they shared their own stories: Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, different wars but similar traumas, similar losses, similar struggles to reconcile what they'd seen and done with the peaceful civilian lives they were trying to live. The other customers in the diner watched this informal support group form in the corner booth and understood they were witnessing something profound. Veterans of different generations finding connection, healing, and brotherhood in a small-town diner on a Saturday morning. The legal case against Trenton Blake moved forward despite his father's attempts to interfere. Richard Blake tried to get the charges dropped, tried to pay off Harold Mitchell, tried to use his influence with local officials. But the video of his son spitting on a World War II veteran had gone viral, and there was too much public attention for the case to be quietly buried. The prosecutor was a veteran herself. Marines served in Afghanistan, and she was absolutely not going to let this slide. She charged Trenton with assault on an elderly person, a felony in Pennsylvania that carried serious consequences even for a minor. The judge was a strict, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Henderson, who had a particular soft spot for veterans. Her father had served in Korea, and who was unimpressed by Richard Blake's money and threats. She listened to the evidence, watched the video, heard Harold's statement, and the statements from the Iron Veterans MC members who had witnessed the aftermath. She found Trenton guilty and sentenced him to 2 years of probation with specific conditions. He would complete 500 hours of community service, specifically at the VA hospital, and with veterans organizations. He would attend mandatory counseling for substance abuse and anger management. He would write a research paper on World War II veterans and the D-Day invasion, and he would personally attend the next local Veterans Day ceremony and help organize it. Furthermore, She ordered Trenton to pay restitution to Harold Mitchell for emotional distress, $20,000, to be paid from Trenton's trust fund, not his parents' money. "Mr. Blake," Judge Henderson said during sentencing, "you're 17 years old, which means you're old enough to know better. You come from privilege and advantage that most people will never have. Instead of using that privilege responsibly, you used it to demean and assault someone who served this country with honor. Mr. Mitchell survived battles that would have broken most men, came home and lived a quiet, decent life, and asked nothing in return except basic respect. You couldn't even give him that," she continued. "But I'm also going to give you something that many young people in your position don't get, a real opportunity to change. Your sentence is designed not just to punish you, but to educate you. You're going to spend significant time with veterans, listening to their stories, learning their sacrifices, understanding what service means. If you take this seriously, if you genuinely work to become a better person, then maybe something good can come from this terrible incident. But if you violate probation, if you don't take this seriously, you'll serve the remainder of your sentence as an adult in county jail. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, Your Honor," Trenton said quietly. "I want to change. I want to do better." And surprisingly, he meant it. The incident at the Riverside Diner had been a watershed moment for Trenton. The first time in his life, he had faced real consequences and real shame. The video of him spitting on Harold had been shared millions of times, and the comments section was brutal. His privileged friends had abandoned him. His father was furious, not because Trenton had assaulted someone, but because he had embarrassed the family publicly. His mother was in denial, insisting her son was the real victim. But the Iron Veterans MC had offered him something different. Not excuses, not enabling, but accountability combined with a path to redemption. True to their word, they brought Trenton to the VA hospital every month. They introduced him to veterans who were dying alone, veterans struggling with PTSD, veterans dealing with the physical and mental scars of service. Trenton heard their stories. He listened to a Vietnam vet describe the nightmares that had plagued him for 50 years. He sat with a World War II veteran who had no family and who cried because Trenton was the first visitor he'd had in months. He helped organize a meal for homeless veterans and heard about their struggles to survive after coming home from war. And slowly, painfully, Trenton began to understand. These weren't just old people or boring history lessons. These were human beings who had sacrificed and suffered and carried burdens that Trenton couldn't imagine. And they were largely ignored by society, dismissed as irrelevant, forgotten despite everything they'd given. Gunnar took Trenton under his wing in a way the teenager's own father never had. He was firm but not cruel, demanding but not demeaning. He expected Trenton to show up, to listen, to work, to think. And when Trenton struggled or complained, Gunnar would share stories from his own experience, the mistakes he'd made as a young Marine, the lessons he'd learned the hard way, the men who had set him straight when he needed it. "Nobody's born knowing how to be a good person," Gunnar told Trenton during one of their rides to the VA hospital. "It's something you learn and choose and work at every single day. You made a terrible mistake, but you're young enough to correct course. The question is whether you will." 6 months into his sentence, Trenton had his next scheduled visit with Harold Mitchell. The Iron Veterans MC had arranged it, ensuring that the meetings were supervised and that Harold was comfortable. They met at the Riverside Diner with Gunnar and 2 other veterans present. Trenton was nervous, having spent months thinking about what he'd done and understanding more deeply how wrong it had been. Harold was gracious but wary, willing to meet but not sure what to expect. They talked for 2 hours. Trenton shared what he'd been learning at the VA hospital, the stories he'd heard, the veterans he'd met. He told Harold about a World War II veteran he'd befriended who had survived the Battle of the Bulge and who reminded Trenton of Harold. "He told me about his best friend who died in the snow," Trenton said, his voice thick with emotion. "About holding him while he bled out, and there was nothing anyone could do. And I thought about how you described the same thing on Omaha Beach. And I realized these weren't just stories. These were real people you loved who died in front of you. And I mocked that. I'm so sorry, Mr. Mitchell. I understand now why that was so unforgivably cruel." Harold listened, studied the young man in front of him, and saw something different from the drunk, arrogant teenager who had spit on him. "You're doing the work," Harold said finally. "That's what matters. You could have resented the sentence, fought against it, refused to learn. But you're actually trying. I respect that." "I want to ask you something," Trenton said hesitantly. Would you be willing to talk to me about your experiences? Really talk? I wrote that research paper the judge assigned, but I want to understand more. I want to hear your story, if you're willing to share it." Harold looked at Gunnar, who nodded encouragingly, and then back at Trenton. "All right, but not today. This has been a good start, but I need time. Come back next month, and if you're serious about learning, I'll tell you what it was really like, the truth, not the sanitized version." Trenton came back the next month, and the month after that. Over the course of a year, Harold Mitchell and Trenton Blake developed an unlikely relationship. Not quite friendship, but something more meaningful. Harold told Trenton stories he'd never told anyone, not even his own children. Stories about the fear before the invasion, about the boys who cried for their mothers as they died, about the guilt of surviving when so many didn't, about the decades of nightmares and survivors' guilt. And Trenton listened, really listened. He asked questions, took notes, and began to understand that history wasn't about dates and battles. It was about human beings facing impossible situations and finding courage they didn't know they had. One day, about 18 months after the incident, Harold gave Trenton something precious. It was a box containing letters, the ones Dorothy had written to Harold during the war, and the ones Harold had written back. "I want you to read these," Harold said. "I want you to understand what it was like for the people back home, waiting and praying and hoping their loved ones would survive. War doesn't just affect the soldiers, it affects everyone who loves them." Trenton read the letters and cried, at Dorothy's worry and love, at Harold's attempts to reassure her, while clearly terrified himself, at the young couple they had been, whose future was so uncertain. He returned the letters carefully and said, "Thank you for trusting me with these. I'll never forget what you've taught me." When Trenton turned 18 and completed his probation, the judge held a final hearing to officially close his case. She asked him what he had learned, and Trenton spoke for 20 minutes about veterans, sacrifice, respect, privilege, and the importance of seeing other people as fully human rather than as obstacles or servants. "A year and a half ago, I was the worst version of myself," Trenton said. "I was cruel, entitled, and ignorant. I hurt someone who deserved nothing but respect, and I did it because I could, because I'd never faced real consequences for my actions. The sentence you gave me, Judge Henderson, changed my life. Not because it punished me, but because it educated me. I've spent hundreds of hours with veterans, hearing their stories, understanding their sacrifices. I've learned what service means, what courage looks like, what it costs to protect freedom. He turned to face Harold, who was sitting in the gallery with Gunner and several other Iron Veterans MC members. Mr. Mitchell, I can never undo what I did to you. I can never take back those words or that moment. But I can promise you that I'm not that person anymore. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of your forgiveness and trying to honor veterans the way they deserve. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for showing me what real strength and grace look like. Harold stood up, his body bent with age, but his spirit clearly moved by Trenton's words. Young man, you've done the work, you've taken responsibility, and you've genuinely changed. That takes real courage. I forgive you completely. The courtroom erupted in applause. Even the judge had tears in her eyes as she officially closed Trenton's case, noting for the record that this was one of the most successful rehabilitations she had witnessed in her 20 years on the bench. But Trenton's transformation didn't end with the completion of his probation. He had discovered something during those 18 months of court-ordered service, a purpose that had been missing from his privileged, aimless life. He had found meaning in serving others, particularly veterans who had given so much and received so little in return. He deferred his admission to the expensive private university his father had selected and instead enrolled at the local community college, majoring in social work with a focus on veteran services. He continued volunteering at the VA hospital, not because he had to anymore, but because he wanted to. He joined the Iron Veterans MC as a supporter member, not a full member, since he hadn't served in the military, but someone who rode with them, helped with their charity events, and dedicated himself to their mission of supporting veterans. His relationship with his father deteriorated further. Richard Blake was disgusted by his son's choices, viewing them as a rejection of the family's wealth and status. But Trenton had finally found the courage to stand up to his father, to reject the values of entitlement and cruelty that had defined his upbringing. "You're throwing away your future," Richard said during one heated argument. "No, Dad," Trenton replied calmly. "I'm building a future that actually means something. Money and status didn't make me happy. They made me cruel. I'd rather be poor and decent than rich and terrible." His mother, Victoria, eventually came around, watching her son transform from an arrogant bully into a compassionate young man who dedicated his time to helping others, forced her to examine her own values and choices. She began volunteering alongside Trenton at veteran events, and the experience changed her too. She apologized to Harold personally for her son's behavior and for her own initial response, which had been to blame everyone except Trenton. "I failed as a mother," she told Harold during one of Trenton's visits to the Riverside diner. "I raised him to believe that money made him special, that other people existed to serve him. I taught him terrible values, and he hurt you because of my failures. I'm so sorry." Harold, ever gracious, simply said, "You're here now. That's what matters. Parents make mistakes, but the best parents learn from them. Your son is becoming a good man. Be proud of that." 2 years after the incident, the Riverside Diner held a special event, a Veterans Day breakfast where veterans ate for free, and the community came together to honor their service. Trenton had organized most of it, working with Jenny and the Morrison family to coordinate food donations, decorations, and guest speakers. Over 100 veterans attended, from World War II through recent conflicts in the Middle East. Harold Mitchell was the guest of honor, seated at a special table with the Iron Veterans MC surrounding him. At 90 years old now, he was frailer than ever, his health declining steadily, but his mind was still sharp and his spirit undimmed. Trenton gave a speech that morning, standing before the packed diner with a confidence that came not from arrogance, but from genuine conviction. 3 years ago, I stood in this diner and committed one of the worst acts of my life. I spit on a World War II veteran, a man who had survived D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge, who had earned 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star, who had served his country with honor and lived his life with dignity. I did it because I was drunk, entitled, and cruel. I did it because I'd never been taught to see other people as fully human. He paused, looking at Harold. Mr. Mitchell could have pressed for the maximum penalty. He could have demanded I be tried as an adult. He could have refused to ever speak to me again. Instead, with the help of these incredible veterans, he gestured to the Iron Veterans MC. He gave me an opportunity to learn, to change, to become better. And that gift, that grace, changed my entire life. Trenton's voice grew stronger. I learned that veterans aren't just people who served in wars. They're human beings who sacrificed years of their lives, who witnessed horrors most of us can't imagine, who carried physical and emotional scars forever, who lost friends and pieces of themselves in service to this country. They came home to a society that often ignored them, forgot them, or worse, mocked them. And that's wrong. That's fundamentally, deeply wrong. He looked out at the assembled veterans, many of them crying now. Every person in this room who served, you are heroes. Not because you want to be called heroes, but because you did something most people never do. You put your country before yourself. You faced danger for people you'd never meet. You sacrificed for a future you might not live to see. That deserves more than one day of recognition. That deserves our constant gratitude, our support, our commitment to making sure you're taken care of. Trenton's final words were directed at young people in the audience. If you're young like me, listen. Don't make my mistakes. Don't dismiss older people as irrelevant or boring. Don't think your privilege makes you special. Don't treat people cruelly just because you can. Every person you meet has a story, has value, has dignity that deserves respect. Learn that lesson the easy way, through compassion and curiosity, not the hard way, through consequences and shame like I did. The applause was thunderous. Veterans were hugging each other, crying, feeling seen and valued in a way many of them hadn't experienced since they came home from their wars. Harold was openly weeping, and Gunnar had his arm around the elderly veteran's shoulders, both of them too emotional to speak. After the breakfast, after the crowds had dispersed and the diner was returning to normal, Harold asked Trenton to sit with him for a moment. The two of them sat in the corner booth, the same booth where the incident had occurred 3 years earlier, and Harold took Trenton's hands in his own shaking ones. "I need to tell you something," Harold said quietly. "My doctor says I probably have 6 months, maybe a year. The cancer's back, and at my age, I'm not going to fight it. I'm ready to see Dorothy again. I'm ready to rest." Trenton's eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Mitchell, Let me finish," Harold interrupted gently. "I want you to know that these past 3 years, watching you transform from that angry boy into this compassionate young man, it's been one of the greatest privileges of my life. You reminded me that people can change, that forgiveness matters, that even terrible mistakes can lead to beautiful outcomes. You gave me purpose in my final years. So thank you, Trenton. Thank you for doing the work, for really changing, for honoring what I tried to teach you. You saved my life, Trenton said through tears. You and Gunnar and all the veterans who took the time to educate me instead of just punishing me. I was headed down a terrible path, and you redirected me. Whatever good I do with the rest of my life, it's because you cared enough to teach me. Harold smiled, that gentle smile that had characterized his entire life. Then make it count. Live a life that honors all the veterans you've met, all the stories you've heard, all the sacrifices that were made so you could have the freedom to become whoever you choose to be. That's my last request. Make your life count. I promise, Trenton said. I absolutely promise. Harold Mitchell passed away 4 months later, peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by family. His funeral was attended by over 1,000 people, 3 generations of his family, friends from throughout his life, members of the community he had been part of for 87 years, and dozens upon dozens of veterans who had come to know and love him in his final years. The Iron Veterans MC served as honor guard, standing in formation as Harold's casket was carried out of the church. They rode escort to the cemetery, their motorcycles creating a thunderous tribute that echoed through the town. And at the graveside, a bugler played taps, while veterans from 5 different wars saluted the man who had served in the First War. They all honored. Trenton gave one of the eulogies, speaking about Harold's grace, his forgiveness, his willingness to see potential in a troubled young man who had wronged him terribly. He didn't have to forgive me, Trenton said, his voice breaking. He didn't have to teach me or give me chances or believe I could change. But he did. And because he did, I'm standing here as a better person than I would have been. That's Harold Mitchell's final legacy. Not just the heroism of his youth, but the grace and wisdom of his age. After the funeral, Gunnar pulled Trenton aside. Harold left something for you, he said, handing over a box. He wanted you to have this. Inside was Harold's bronze star, along with a letter written in shaking handwriting. Trenton, this medal was given to me for pulling 3 wounded men to safety under fire. I was just doing what needed doing, nothing more. But if courage is doing the right thing, even when it's hard, even when you're scared, even when it costs you something, then you've earned this more than I ever did. You had the courage to face your mistakes, to change yourself completely, to become someone new. That's real bravery. Wear it with pride, and remember, the measure of a person isn't their worst moment. It's what they do after it. You chose to be better. I'm proud of you. Harold, Trenton broke down completely, clutching the medal and sobbing in Gunnar's arms. I don't deserve this. I can't. He wanted you to have it, Gunnar said firmly. And Harold Mitchell was right about most things. You've earned it, kid. Not through military service, but through the hardest kind of service, facing yourself honestly and doing the painful work of change. That takes real courage. Trenton had the medal mounted in a shadow box, along with a photograph of Harold in his uniform from 1944, and the letter. He hung it in his office, first at the social work practice he opened after graduating, and later at the Veteran Resource Center he founded in Harold's name. The Harold Mitchell Center for Veteran Services opened 5 years after the incident at the Riverside Diner, funded by donations from the community, from Trenton's own money, He had gained access to his trust fund and immediately used most of it for the center. And from grants that Trenton worked tirelessly to secure, the center provided comprehensive services for veterans: counseling, job training, housing assistance, medical care coordination, and simply a place where veterans could gather and support each other. Gunner served on the board of directors, along with several other members of the Iron Veterans MC and Dorothy Mitchell's children, who had been moved by the transformation they'd witnessed in Trenton and wanted to honor their father's legacy. The center's motto, displayed prominently in the lobby, was a quote from Harold: "The measure of a person isn't their worst moment, it's what they do after it." Trenton spent the next decade of his life dedicated to veteran services. He completed his master's degree in social work, specializing in trauma and PTSD. He published research on rehabilitation programs for young offenders, using his own case as a primary example of how consequences combined with education could create genuine transformation. He spoke at conferences and universities about privilege, accountability, and the importance of veteran services. He married a woman he met while volunteering at the VA hospital, a nurse who shared his commitment to serving others. They had 2 children, and Trenton raised them very differently than he had been raised, teaching them about respect, service, humility, and the importance of seeing every person's humanity. He took his children to visit Harold's grave regularly, telling them the story of how an elderly veteran he had wronged had shown him grace and changed his life. He wanted them to understand that their comfortable life came with responsibilities: to serve others, to honor those who sacrificed, to never take their advantages for granted. The Iron Veterans MC became Trenton's chosen family. He rode with them on charity runs, helped organize their events, and eventually, in a special ceremony when he turned 30, they awarded him an honorary membership, an extremely rare honor for someone who hadn't served in the military, but one the members voted unanimously to bestow. "You've served veterans for over a decade," Gunner said during the ceremony, now in his 80s but still riding. "You've dedicated your life to honoring military service and supporting those who served. That's a different kind of service, but it's service nonetheless. Welcome to the Brotherhood, brother." 15 years after the incident, the Riverside Diner held another commemoration. This time, celebrating the anniversary of the day, everything changed. Jenny was still there, now co-owner of the diner, after the Morrison family retired. The corner booth had a permanent plaque: "The Harold Mitchell Table, reserved for veterans and those who honor them." The event drew national media attention as the story had become famous, used in schools to teach about accountability and redemption, referenced in discussions about criminal justice reform, highlighted as an example of successful rehabilitation. Trenton, now in his early 30s and a respected advocate for veteran services, gave interviews about his journey. He was always honest about his past, never trying to minimize what he'd done or paint himself as a hero. "I was a terrible person who did a terrible thing," he would say. "I don't get credit for becoming decent. That's the baseline of acceptable human behavior. But I'm grateful every day for the people who gave me a chance to change, who educated me instead of just punishing me, who saw potential in someone who didn't deserve it." Harold Mitchell, Gunner Patterson, the entire Iron Veterans MC, they saved me, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to honor that gift. When asked what advice he would give to young people struggling with entitlement or cruelty, Trenton always said the same thing. Understand that other people are real. They have feelings, stories, value, dignity. They're not NPCs in your life story. They're the protagonists of their own stories. When you truly understand that, when you see everyone's humanity, it becomes impossible to treat people cruelly. And if you've already made mistakes like I did, know that change is possible. But only if you face what you've done honestly and do the hard work of becoming better. There are no shortcuts. There's just the daily choice to be less terrible than you were yesterday. 20 years after spitting on Harold Mitchell, Trenton Blake stood at the dedication ceremony for a new wing of the Veteran Resource Center. The Harold Mitchell Memorial Wing would provide housing for homeless veterans, fulfilling a dream Harold had shared with Trenton during one of their conversations. He told me that the hardest thing about working at the VA hospital was seeing veterans with nowhere to go. Trenton told the assembled crowd. Men and women who had served their country ending up on the streets, forgotten and abandoned. He said if he had the resources, he'd build a place where every veteran had a safe, dignified home. Well, Harold, we did it. 20 apartments, fully furnished, completely free for veterans in need. This is your dream realized. He turned to the statue they were unveiling, a bronze sculpture of Harold Mitchell in his uniform at age 19, standing next to an image of Harold at 87, spanning the arc of an entire life of service and grace. The inscription read, Harold Mitchell, 1925 to 2015, World War II, veteran, hero, teacher, the man who believed people could change, gunner, now in his late 80s and using a cane but still sharp and commanding, stood next to Trenton. Harold would be proud of you, son, proud of what you've built, proud of the man you became, proud of the lives you've touched. That's his real legacy, not just his own service, but the ripples he created by choosing grace over vengeance. He saved my life, Trenton said simply, and I'll never stop being grateful. As the ceremony concluded and people filed through the new facility, marveling at the comfortable apartments that would provide homes for veterans who had been living on the streets, one of the first residents approached Trenton nervously. He was a Vietnam veteran in his 70s, weathered and worn from years of hard living, but with eyes that lit up as he showed Trenton his new apartment. I haven't had my own place in 12 years, he said, his voice shaking with emotion. I've been sleeping in shelters, under bridges, anywhere I could find, and now this beautiful apartment, all mine, because I served my country 45 years ago. Someone remembered, someone cared. Thank you so much. Trenton hugged him, fighting tears. Thank you for your service, sir. This is the least we owe you. Welcome home. And in that moment, standing in a building named for the man he'd wronged and who had saved him, providing housing for a veteran who had been forgotten by society, surrounded by the Iron Veterans MC, who had become his brothers, doing work that gave his life meaning and purpose. Trenton Blake understood the full weight of Harold Mitchell's final lesson. The measure of a person isn't their worst moment, it's what they do after it. He had spent 20 years trying to become worthy of Harold's forgiveness. He would spend the rest of his life continuing that work, serving veterans, honoring their sacrifices, making sure they were valued and supported and remembered. Not because he had to, but because Harold had taught him that this was what a life well lived looked like. Not perfection, not absence of mistakes, but the courage to face those mistakes honestly, the humility to learn from them, and the commitment to spend every day after trying to be better. That was Harold's legacy, and now it was Trenton's mission. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories about redemption, grace, and the transformative power of accountability. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that change is possible, that mistakes don't define us forever, and that sometimes the people we wrong become the people who save us. Comment below with your own stories of transformation or second chances, because Harold Mitchell's lesson lives on in all of us. We all have the power to be better than our worst moments. We all have the responsibility to see each other's humanity, and we all have the opportunity to choose grace over vengeance. Thank you for watching, and remember, make your life count.